So please help me welcome Jonathan.
So first of all, thank you all very much for having me here to speak today. And thank you to all the people of the Shuswap Band and all the people who've welcomed us here. I'm kind of curious to myself why I might be qualified to come and speak to you all today. And as my bio says, I come from a background, I am an economist, I'm a resource and environmental economist. I worked in Ottawa for a number of years with a couple of different departments, but I also come from a small community in the Ottawa Valley. It's where I grew up, and it's a town of about 6,000 people. And for most of my adult life, I've been living in smaller communities, and it's really driven my interests in my research and my work. And I've been fortunate enough to work with the Rural Development Institute for the last 4 years on a whole host of different topics. It's been absolutely fascinating. So I was asked to come here today and speak to you about rural issues. And so I would like to jump through a little bit briefly over a number of issues. Now, I also teach at the college in Castlegar, Selkirk College. And in that role as a teacher, we occasionally have these discussions amongst ourselves about what our role is. And someone mentioned to me this notion that what a good teacher or instructor does is not to present anything new to people. We all already know most of this information intuitively through our backgrounds, but what a good instructor does is to lend a structure, to give us something that we can hierarchically organize our information with. So while I don't expect any of these issues that I'm going to bring up to you today are new to anyone, hopefully it's just a little bit of setting the scene for what you're going to be discussing over the next couple of days. So in broad strokes, what I'm going to discuss with you here are some of the nature of our networks, just a very brief reminder, a brief overview of some economic issues, some cultural and social issues, and a couple of thoughts about some of the overriding issues that prevent or help us deal with these issues as they come up individually. Now, in terms of our rural networks, it's becoming a more and more important piece in the work I do with the Rural Development Institute is understanding how connected we all are. And the list that I'm about to provide you is by no means complete. Absolutely not. I just pulled together a few organizations in about 10 minutes of an internet search just to start getting a bit of a taste of the number of organizations that are around. We've got a number of different trusts throughout British Columbia that are focused on assisting with rural issues. We've got some economic development associations at the provincial level. We've got Work BC at the provincial level. We've got education ministries and organizations at the provincial and local levels. We've got the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, which is also another resource that connects together some 3,700 municipalities in Canada, many of those rural. Organizations like Invest Kootenay that are a little bit more locally focused, helping with investment issues. Organizations like Community Futures, again, quite connected in with the communities where they operate. And of course, we've got these organizations, the different beetle coalitions across British Columbia, which are all focused on rural development issues. And finally, an organization like the one where I work, the Rural Development Institute, which is focused on rural development issues, and the Canadian Rural Revitalization Foundation, which if you've not heard of, I would highly encourage you to sign up for their newsletter. They offer some wonderful conferences. I left some materials out on the table out front where people could get some reference to that. Wonderful resources. They issue all sorts of papers and they host excellent conferences bringing in experts from all around the world. Again, this list is nowhere near complete. It certainly doesn't include any of the municipalities or any of the social service organizations or the small NGOs on the ground directly in our communities. But I really wanted to remind people that you're not alone in these communities where we're operating, that we're part of a bigger network, and it really behooves us all to figure out who those players are in our networks and to become as connected as possible. So With a little bit of an overview of economic issues, I wanted to start off talking about investment. I noticed that it shows up on the conference agenda. Very, very important issue, looking at investment in these small rural communities. It's one of the founding determinants of productivity and economic growth. Having investment, both financial investment, capital investment, and human resource investment. Specifically looking at financial investment into technologies and capital. This is the big driver of productivity, allowing us to leverage up all of our labor productivity and make bigger gains within our communities. But that investment has to come from somewhere, particularly in smaller communities. We don't have a banking system that's particularly well set up to deal with the growth phase of a lot of businesses who've moved beyond being able to ask their relatives and friends for investment startup money and getting into major investments. So who do they look to for this bridge financing? And there's been a couple of interesting developments. One in particular, I was speaking this morning about the Christina Lake movement, which is moving towards creating an organization that's trying to fill some of the gaps on bridge financing. In the work that we do through the Rural Development Institute, I help run a program called the Business Retention and Expansion Project, where communities go out and interview their businesses and learn about what the pressures are. And the number one barrier to expansion that our survey respondents mentioned was their access to finance and what a hindrance it was to their being able to expand. And out of this group, this was, I think our sample size was about 800 different businesses for this particular survey. And out of those 800 businesses, there was roughly $450 million worth of investments waiting to occur within the 3-year time frame. So there's considerable amount of movement that is looking to happen. I'm sure everyone's heard of the skills gap. We've got an ever-changing economy, and we've got needs within the workforce that need to be developed and to bring up our workforce into leveraging its capacity to the best way possible. In the basin boundary, we've got 72% of all the jobs from those people that I mentioned that we surveyed, the 800 businesses within the basin boundary. 72% of the jobs there were for skilled and semi-skilled workers, and only 8% of the jobs that they indicated were for entry-level positions. And there's a big need for training and bringing up the workforce to that level of performance. And we want to make sure that in all of those educational endeavors that we're taking on trying to train people, that we're actually training people to lead and to become innovators and really capitalize on all of the opportunity that we've got at our fingertips. We've got infrastructure issues. I'm sure this is common across the board too. Our physical infrastructure is getting old. We've had chronic underinvestment in physical infrastructure. This is nothing new. We've also got information infrastructure. We're still waiting for high-speed broadband in a lot of the smaller communities. It's a difficult sell to the broadband suppliers to get that service into these small communities, but it's another stumbling block for these communities in terms of developing the higher skilled growth sectors. And our healthcare and education infrastructure is starting to feel a little bit stretched thin as well. We've got our leaders. We've got our elected leaders around the country. I had fun with that. And they're supported by administration staff. But there's a wide variety of knowledge bases in this group of people, both administrative staff and the elected officials. The elected officials change over every election period. And it's not clear that they've necessarily got all the tools necessary for economic development delivery or for some of the social program delivery. And they need a lot of support, both on the administration side and the elected official side. What we term capacity for strategic planning and action. And in the work that I've done with the Business Retention Expansion Project, again, across the board, across British Columbia and for people in Ontario, areas where a lot of these projects have been successfully delivered, the number one factor that is contributing to that success is the capacity for strategic planning and action within the communities. And this also includes, by the way, all of our NGOs and all of the other service organizations within our communities. It's not all squarely resting on the shoulders of our elected officials and administration. But capacity is a big deal. We need to foster that, build it up so that we've got a group of people who are getting the absolute most out of our resources. We've also got supply chain issues. I've been working recently with a group of people looking at agriculture issues in the basin boundary area. As a small example, the cattle industry. In our area, there's difficulty getting access to abattoirs. So people raise cattle, and if they want to be commercial with the end product, they ship all of their cows to Alberta for finishing, for processing, and then bring it all back into the Kootenay boundary, basin boundary area. That's a big leak. It's a big leak leaving our local economy, and it's not restricted to the agriculture sector. I work with the mining and metallurgical sector as well, on a group that's focused on cluster development. And this is constant topic of conversation, is the amount of leakage out of the supply chain, and the fact that there is a great desire to work more locally with suppliers and producers, but either they're unavailable, the quality isn't sufficient, or some other type of issue like that with the supply chain just coming up short. We certainly live in a world where both rural and urban groups have to function together and coexist. But I don't think it's much of a surprise to anyone that most of the money and the resources tend to focus on urban issues. And we've got urban-centric policies. Funding, I was speaking with Gordon Borgstrom before coming to the conference and discussing that first slide where I was looking at networks. And I was asking about some of his organizations, and the topic of Western economic diversification or Industry Canada came up, and he said, wow, you know, those organizations, they continually underfund our region, and it's almost impossible for us to put together programs that would be funded by those groups because it's so focused on the urban agenda and on the resources available to those types of organizations. I thought, you know, that's absolutely correct, but it's not just for funding organizations. There are policies like the ones around our abattoirs and food systems that do not help out those folks in the rural context. We've got services at the federal level, like the labor force survey. If anyone here has ever tried to work with any of the labor force numbers in the rural context, you always come up with these zeros in all of the tables because they undersample for our area, or they do not sample sufficiently in order to give us detailed information for our region. So we constantly wind up with no numbers to work with, to learn about. The elimination of the long-form census gutted our ability to have good statistical information for a lot of our programming. It's not restricted to federal policies framework as well, though, but our development policies, development red tape at the municipal level and the regional level. Quite often, the availability of lands and the development process and the amount of time and effort it takes to walk through those winds up holding up development at a more localized level. So, I also mentioned that I work for the Rural Development Institute, and we've kind of broken up our thinking about rural issues into four strategic pillars: economic, cultural, social, and environmental. And I had to think about what I was doing and realize that I hadn't included anything on the environmental pillar. I want to acknowledge that here as I go through. The environmental pillar, certainly, we all face a group of common environmental concerns. And I wasn't really sure why I focused exclusively on the economic, social, and cultural while I was putting together these thoughts. But I think the environmental issues, I want to acknowledge them, but I think that there's a lot of commonality to those, and the approaches tend to be a little bit more localized in how we go about dealing with those for those specific local issues. But I'm going to carry on with the social and cultural issues here. talk. First of all, we just had a wonderful discussion from our chief here in the local band, and we've got a long history with Aboriginal people in Canada overall. It's an incredible resource with a long history and knowledge of the area. And I was recently at a conference in Ontario looking at poverty issues, and the opening address was from the chief of the Algonquin band. And the chief came up and was discussing their historical understanding or memory of how the relationship had developed between the Algonquin people and the colonial interests in Canada. And they talked, and there were some elements of this in terms of learning how we've got to cooperate together. We're all in this together, which we just heard very strongly from our opening talk here. And this fellow from the Algonquin band said, you know, when the Native peoples looked at the original agreements that were being settled way back when, they thought of it as a marriage contract that they were entering into, where we're going to work together. And in hindsight, it seems to have been treated more like a divorce contract. You'll get this, we'll get that. And it speaks to an unfortunate mentality that's been pervasive in this country for most of our modern history. And it's worth recognizing that we can move beyond that and work in a positive way together. And we've got a bunch of issues. These might not be issues that we've got a lot of control over at the rural level in terms of land claims negotiations and the conditions that are existing, social and economic conditions within some of the Native populations. But we've got to acknowledge these and consider these when we're looking at ways forward. And again, an incredible resource of people and knowledge that we should really capitalize on and work together and come up with good solutions. The notion of capacity comes up again and again, not just in economic development circles, but in all of our social and cultural delivery programs. More often than not, the supply or our ability to supply services comes nowhere near meeting the demand. We get people who fall through the cracks, and we wind up trying to do this sort of a job with this equipment. I don't know, does everyone recognize the Commodore 64? Do you remember that thing? That was kind of a funny little thing to find. We're constantly asking our local organizations to do a lot with very limited resources. And this capacity issue is pervasive across the board. We talk a lot about youth out-migration and the culture of education in the upcoming generation that's going to be contributing to our workforce. And we've got issues around quality of education. Again, I teach at the college in Castlegar, and we have these discussions. People always say, "Oh, things are going to hell in a handbasket today, and it's not the way it used to be." I couldn't possibly tell you whether it's the way it used to be or not. I have no context to assess that. But I've certainly got a number of concerns. This cartoon here, we've got someone Googling what's 12 divided by 3. And I consistently get people pulling out calculators to divide by 10 in my classes. I'm a little terrified by that. And again, speaking to this, what are we bringing up? Are we training people to innovate? Are we training people to lead? Are we giving people the skills that we need to fill the skills gap and to move us forward positively? We've got this whole missing age group. It's a constant thing. I'm sure that it's across the board. People leaving in that critical age between 19 and 25. Now, we also see people coming back in the mid-30s, early mid-30s age. But this is an issue around the board. In the Kootenay development region, our rate of post-secondary education is 7% lower than the provincial average. And the provincial average is 3% lower than the national average. So, not that post-secondary education is the be-all, end-all, but it's a good indicator of the culture around education for the youth that we're creating. Might be worth thinking about in the future. The family. Family's central to a lot of people's happiness in the social and cultural context. And people need to have support for the family and for their quality of life. In the basin boundary, the big concerns that came out of our research work with the public is the People really care about childcare, about jobs for both partners in a spousal relationship, and affordable housing. All of these things are critical issues to supporting our families, making sure that we've got good quality of life. We've got an aging population. This is certainly something that comes up all the time in the Basin Boundary, whether or not we're age-friendly, whether we've got the age infrastructure. And we're going to need to consider what it is that we're developing. It's a wonderful market opportunity. There's quite a few age-friendly services that could be coming up and developed for a lot of communities to really capitalize on this, but it's also putting strain specifically on the age-centric infrastructure in our healthcare. And I wanted to mention poverty. It's on the top of my mind. I just got back from a poverty conference. And poverty has all sorts of issues. It's prevalent in every community in Canada, I'm sure. It can wind up creating homelessness and child poverty. And this creates long-term chronic problems in the population. It really stifles a lot of growth, it stifles a lot of opportunity, and creates awful conditions for too many people. Some of the problems that we think about, it's not just their problem, the people who are suffering from poverty, but it's everyone's. Creates problems with absenteeism from workplace. Creates all sorts of personal problems for the people who are living through it. Creates extra strain on our healthcare. And here's the one that blew me away, talking to some folks from Hamilton, comparing one of the richest neighborhoods in Hamilton to one of the poorest. Now, I've since forgotten the stats, but an emergency room visit to a hospital costs some order of magnitude more than going through your regular GP through a healthcare clinic. It's vastly more expensive because of the equipment and the type of hours and the supplies that they've got there. Now, the richest neighborhood in Hamilton has roughly 100 visits from the entire neighborhood, 100 visits to the emergency room on an annual basis. The poorest neighborhood in Hamilton has 1,600 to 1,700 visits to the same ER over the same period of time. And this creates quite a drain on the healthcare services. It creates abominable conditions for the people living through it, but it's also an unnecessary strain on the overall infrastructure. And finally, poverty also contributes to crime issues. So there are issues around poverty that affect us all, not least of which from a moral standpoint. So these problems are common. These problems are common, and I hope that everyone in here has kind of nodded their head a little bit. Yes, that seems like home to me. So why do we continually struggle with this? Why is it that these problems are common across the board and we're still facing them and wondering what on earth to do? Well, they're tough problems. Certainly, they're tough problems to deal with. But beyond that, there's got to be something else. And so I was asked to come and talk about the issues facing us, but I wanted to leave on a couple of other notes where we've got something to try to unify across these different issues and to think about over the course of the next couple of days. I've got the feeling that we overvalue uniqueness. People are constantly trying to reinvent the wheel, and what this does is this tends to foster in us the belief that we're alone and that our problem is so vastly different from everyone else's that we've got to come up with our own solution. And it leads us away from collaborating and cooperating. And I really like this little cartoon here. We got the two people who are actually working together, and they've got a round wheel and they're getting the job done. And the one who's decided to work on their own, struggling with a square wheel. So this comes into these turf wars that we constantly see. You know, people not wanting to accept help or to allow other people into their problems or their issues in that localized context. It prevents us from seeing opportunities to work together. The value of our networks really depends on us using them and contributing to them. Again, this notion of capacity, in the absence of which I've called it ad hocery. Having a vision, having a plan is important, very, very important. And having the capacity to develop those plans is a precondition to getting to those plans. One of my favorite quotes that I've heard around the notion of planning is that if you don't know where you're going, you're going to get there. think about that. Resources aren't about to land in our plates. You know, money's being pulled back all over the place, and we've got to become more resourceful. And part of that is going to be drawing on our networks and making sure that we're fully leveraging all the cooperative opportunities that are in front of us. And in terms of developing capacity, we need to learn, we need to instruct, we need to teach, we need to collectively become better at working with data, generating it ourselves if the federal powers that be and provincial powers that be are going to continually reduce the number of data sources that we've got open to us. We should be thinking about this and trying to develop more sources and get creative with data. And I think that there might be some image problems. All of these, by the way, are quite linked to one another. We're a resource economy. We're a tourism economy. You might be. You might be. But beware of the limited thinking, right? Focusing on industries. In particular, I've picked a little bit on resource industries and tourism industries. There's aspects about both that I favor hugely. I think they're wonderful and they should be part of our economic makeup. But focusing on these tends to open us up to quite a bit of swing in the global economy. They're quite exposed. Tourism is a luxury good. It's going to be one of the first things that cut off of people's budget when the economy takes a downswing. Resource prices are typically quite tightly tied to the economic fates of the entire world, right? We've got, that might be completely unreadable. The quote says something like, we have for the first time an economy based on a key resource, information, that is not only renewable but self-generating. Running out of it is not a problem, but drowning in it is. We've got a lot of opportunities open to us. We've got a lot more resources than we often think we do. And we've got the opportunity to create our own economy and to take that control. And we've got to be aware of that limited thinking that prevents us from getting there. So, on a positive note, I didn't want to leave it all doom and gloom. We do have some strengths in the rural communities. First of all, people. We've got an incredible resource in our people. There's this notion that I've been reading more and more about the sense of place. And one of the questions we ask residents of the basin boundary area in one of our annual polls is about where they live. And we had 86% of our poll respondents just love where they live. This is a strength, it's a resource that can be leveraged and capitalized upon. Our people are strong, innovative, and creative. I'm constantly blown away with some of the innovative solutions, the backyard, and when I say, we talked about education earlier, about the importance of post-secondary, it's a good indicator of our attitudes towards education, sure, but I've seen incredible solutions and incredible technologies developed in backyards to deal with all sorts of various and sundry problems, and we've got creative people. I'm just not sure we're leveraging them completely. We've got incredible geography that contributes to that sense of place. It's natural beauty. It's going to draw in our tourists. It's going to protect us to a certain extent from overdevelopment. It's slowing things down in that extent and giving us time to think about it. It's an inspiration on a daily basis. And we've got these communities that are caring and supportive. And one of the other things, again, I'm going to draw up just because it was the most recent experience I've had on this conference in Ottawa on poverty. One of the keynote speakers was Mayor Nenshi from Calgary. And he was talking about his very humble upbringing. He grew up in an immigrant family to Canada, and they were what we would term very, very poor. And he credits his ascension to his current position and his achievements that he's made today to the strength of the community support that he got within both the immigrant community in Calgary and the greater community in Calgary, in terms of encouraging him to go to school, encouraging him to go out and get all the experiences he possibly could. People within the community with very limited means offering financial support in times of need. And getting all of that support from below allowed him to float on that and to achieve wonderful things. And one of the first things that I noticed when I moved into the Kootenays, I moved to the Kootenays in 2006, and I just spent a couple of years living in Ottawa. And for the first couple of years that I lived in the community of New Denver, I worked as a forest technologist and banging nails in construction. And I couldn't ignore the fact that I'm an economist. It's kind of in my blood now. And you know, I would read up about some of the stats for our area about the per capita GDP, about the average incomes, about the types of industries that were going on. And reading through the stats, I questioned why anyone would move there, least of all myself. And it seemed like this area is quite depressed, isn't it? But there's this incredible richness in the entire community around me. And it became very quickly evident that people in these rural communities step out of their way at the drop of a hat to help one another out. And this is an incredible strength in these small communities. Not to be ignored at all. Finally, these issues, I hope you would all agree, these are common issues and challenges. While that's created a dispersion of our efforts, it's also offering us the opportunity to work together collectively. Each one of our communities is small, and we don't have a huge voice on the federal playing field, but together we certainly can come up with a little bit louder squeaks. And we should take full advantage of these opportunities that are open to us. Collaboration and cooperation, to me, seem to be the name of the game. So thank you all very much. I hope you have a wonderful week here, and I look forward to all of the excellent speakers who are going to be here. Thank you.